You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute and is sponsored by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Hello, and welcome to episode 315 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. What is it about the American experiment with democracy that has allowed it to persist and endure over the last near 250 years? What is it about early American history that captivates people's attention and makes them want to support the creation of historical scholarship and the sharing of historical knowledge? David M. Rubenstein, a private citizen who is well known for his patriotic philanthropy when it comes to American and United States history, joins us to explore answers to these questions with ideas from his own experience and with details from his book, The American Experiment, Dialogues on a Dream. Now, during our conversation, David reveals ideas about the American experiment in democracy and what has helped this experiment to continue and endure, key attributes of American democracy, and why some of those attributes are under threat or being stress tested, and details about David's philanthropy when it comes to history and why he has a desire to support history education. But first, the holiday season is just about upon us. So as you're thinking about the perfect holiday gift for your history-loving friends and family, please consider a gift subscription to the Ben Franklin's World subscription program. Subscribers receive a special podcast feed where they can access ad-free versions of each episode and a special subscribers-only bonus episode each month. To give a gift subscription, visit benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe. That's benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe. All right, are you ready to investigate the history of American democracy and to learn more about patriotic philanthropy? Let's go meet our expert guest. Our guest is a co-founder and co-chairman of the Carlyle Group, one of the world's largest and most successful private investment firms. He's also a student and avid supporter of history and history education. His efforts in patriotic philanthropy have earned him the Carnegie Medal of Philanthropy and MoMA's David Rockefeller Award. Plus, our guest is also a television host, podcaster, and book author. He's written 3 books. His most recent book is The American Experiment, Dialogues on a Dream. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, David Rubenstein.
Thank you very much for having me. I look forward to our conversation.
Me too. Now, David, we normally speak with a lot of historians on this show. You know, we talk about their books, their historic sites, and their exhibits. And you're not a historian per se, but a really great student and supporter of history. And Jane would like to know how you fell in love with history and how you decided to become a supporter of history and historical institutions with your philanthropy.
Well, it's serendipity a bit. I was interested in politics as a young man, and ultimately I wanted to work in the White House. And lo and behold, I got a job at the White House when I was 27 years old. I wasn't qualified for it, but I took the job nonetheless. Unfortunately, I got inflation to 15%, and we didn't get reelected in 1980. And so I went back and practiced law, but I lived in Washington. And when you work in the White House and you live in Washington, you do get a sense of history. And when I was in college, history was my best subject. So I've always had in the back of my mind that I would like to learn more about history. And then some things happened by serendipity. I bought a copy of the Magna Carta. I started buying rare copies of other documents like the Declaration of Independence. And then I started restoring some historical monuments, memorials. And lo and behold, I became more knowledgeable about history than I had thought I would be. And I'm fortunate that some people think I know a lot about history, even though I'm not a professional historian.
So is early America your favorite period of history? It sounds like from your collecting that it has to be up there, right?
Early American is the period I know a lot about relative to other periods of time. You are a professional historian more than me, so you know more about it. But I do know a lot about the Founding Fathers period, though I'm sure if you ask me a question, I probably won't get it right. So I don't want to make myself sound like I'm a real expert, but I'm a part-time knowledgeable person who is interested in history, but also interested in other people learning about history. That's my main focus. I'm not a professional historian. but I am interested in educating other people about the importance of history for reasons we can discuss.
Yeah, and one of the ways that you seem to help people think through history and to learn more about it is through your book publications. For example, in your new book, The American Experiment, you speak with a whole host of historians, government officials, and veterans who happen to know a lot about different areas of American history and the history of American democracy. And one of the interviews that I found really fascinating is the one you did with Walter Isaacson, who's that biographer who happens to focus on great innovators in history. And I found that interview fascinating because with Isaacson, you two discussed that a key element of success for innovators like Leonardo da Vinci, Benjamin Franklin, and Grace Hopper was their ability to combine their curiosity and knowledge about technology with their curiosity and knowledge about the humanities. So this great insight made me wonder about your experiences, David, because you clearly have a great knowledge and curiosity about history and the humanities, but you describe yourself as a finance guy. So how do you use your interest in history and the humanities in your financial work? And how does your financial work shape how you view history?
Well, I haven't used my history interest to kind of help my financial career, I would say. But when you think about it, I guess maybe there's some element along these lines. When you're a historian, you're always interested in what happened before. How did we get to where we are? And so when I know about that interest, I realize that when I'm looking at an investment, I want to know, where did the CEO come from? What was the history of this company? And I probably probe more than many of my other colleagues in the financial world about the background of the people doing the transaction, the background of the industry involved, the background of the company involved, because I like to know historical facts. When I get a sense of a history of something, I can get a better grounding on what I think is likely to happen. So maybe my interest in history has helped my interest in finance by giving me the willingness to ask questions that maybe others wouldn't ask. Was Walter Isaacson said in many of his books and the people he's written about, what they often have in common is incredible curiosity. And I have a lot of curiosity. And when I was growing up, my mother would call that a yenta. There's a Yiddish word for wanting to know too much, and it's called a yenta. And so my mother would say, don't ask people that come to our house so many questions, you're being a yenta. But maybe in hindsight, I think about it, I'm always curious, always asking people questions, and maybe that helped my interest in history. Maybe it helped my interest in finance.
That's a really good use of history and really good insight. And it doesn't really sound like your interest in history causes you to have too many what would Alexander Hamilton do or what would Albert Gallatin do like moments. Hamilton and Gallatin, of course, being two early secretaries of the Treasury.
No, I don't do that. I try to find what motivated them. In other words, whenever you meet great people, and fortunately, I've gotten to know a number of great people. Sadly, one of them passed away a few days ago, a friend of mine, Colin Powell. And I was just with him about 2 or 3 weeks before he passed away and had a very good conversation about history and various things we were talking about. And I like to ask prominent people about their backgrounds and how they look at history. And I often find that really talented people do have a sense of history in the background, the perspectives. And so when you look at people that are very impressive, I like to kind of say, what did they think about history? Do they know much about history? And so when you meet prominent people, you often say, well, they're not perfect people. They have warts, they have blemishes, and you can overlook them in many cases. The same thing is true with great historical figures. When you were going to grade school, when I was going to grade school, you're much younger than me, this phenomenon was the same. George Washington cut down a cherry tree when he was a little boy, and he told his father he didn't want to tell a lie. Well, we know that that's not true, but we also know that when you get to know people up close, George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, you see their flaws. There's nothing wrong with having flaws. And then when you see famous people today, you realize they have flaws as well. But it's just a sense of getting, what is it that makes somebody want to be a leader? What makes somebody want to be a political figure? And I guess maybe by being interested in history, I kind of have a prism through which I look at a lot of these men and these women.
I'm really sorry for the loss of your friend, Colin Powell. Your interest in asking prominent people about their ideas with regards to history and democracy is something that is very conspicuous in your book, The American Experiment, where you focus on the American experiment in democracy and how this experiment has continued to endure for nearly the last 250 years. And reading your book was a really helpful reminder that everyone seems to have a different and personal answer when it comes to what the American experiment is and what it means. So, David, how do you define the American experiment and what does it mean to you?
Sure. The American experiment, so-called, was an experiment in creating a representative democracy. Generally, there hadn't been governments created out of whole cloth before. And so when our founding fathers came together in Philadelphia, they created this representative democracy. They didn't completely trust democracy. They didn't let individuals vote for the president. We have the Electoral College. They didn't let individuals vote for the senators. They let the state legislators do that. But generally, they provided more representative democracy and the ability to vote than you might say other societies did. Though I should also point out, even for the House of Representatives where they were voting, it was really Christian property men who were white who were voting. So we have to recognize it was not everybody was getting the right to vote. Nonetheless, it was an experiment. And as I said at the beginning of the book, Benjamin Franklin was asked, well, what kind of country or government are you giving us, by a woman that approached him when he was leaving the Independence Hall? And he said, a republic if you can keep it. I think many of the founding fathers thought that it wouldn't last that long. Thomas Jefferson thought maybe 20 years. I think if all of them were to come back today, would be astounded that the government they created almost 250 years ago is still in existence, more or less, with 27 amendments to the Constitution, 10 of them being the Bill of Rights. And so I don't think any other country would have been able to survive this long with one basic document created so long ago.
That's a really interesting thought to think about, how the founders didn't think the republic would survive. Could you maybe elaborate on what their thoughts were and why they thought the government might not survive more than 20 or 30 years?
Well, of course, there was no history of anybody creating a government out of whole cloth and having it last, a quarter of a millennium. Secondly, Thomas Jefferson, who was then in France and was writing to his friend James Madison, who was at the Constitutional Convention, more or less suggested that every 20 years we should have a new government, maybe a new constitution. He wasn't a big fan of having something endure much longer. He later changed his mind about it. But I don't think anybody there thought that they were creating something that would last this long. In fact, anybody who thought they were creating something that would last this long would be considered delusional. If James Madison said this government is going to be around for more or less 250 years, I think they would have put him in an insane asylum or something.
Speaking of Thomas Jefferson, in your book, The American Experiment, you interview Danielle Allen, who's a former Ben Franklin's World guest and the author of Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in defense of equality. And you ask Danielle questions that indicate that you see the founding documents of the United States, documents like the Declaration of Independence, as necessary components of the American experiment in democracy. Could you tell us about the founding documents that you see as most important and why you think they're necessary and critical components of American democracy?
Well, the Declaration of Independence was essentially a public relations propaganda document. It doesn't really have this full effect on law that Constitution does, but it was designed to say, here is why we're doing what we're doing. And it was designed to explain to the American people and King George and anybody else in the world why we were breaking away. But it contains a sentence that is the creed of our country. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When Thomas Jefferson, with the help of Benjamin Franklin, wrote that sentence, they didn't think it would be such a famous sentence. In fact, they barely paid attention to it. The Declaration of Independence was thought to be more important in terms of the sins of King George, and that's what most of the Continental Congress focused on. But this sentence became so important because it became the creed of the country, equality for all people. And when Abraham Lincoln gave his famous Gettysburg Address, he basically reached back to the Declaration of Independence and said 77 years ago, well, he was referring to the Declaration of Independence, not the Constitution, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, many people at the time said that that really wasn't what this country was all about because we didn't really think all people were created equal. But Abraham Lincoln thought that was what Thomas Jefferson was referring to. And in the end, that became the creed of our country. We still are living up to it. And the founding documents are like religious icons. And we also treat our founding fathers like religious figures, maybe. But these religious icons, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, are documents that people quote today. So I just quoted one sentence from the Declaration, but take the Constitution. The Supreme Court spends a large part of its time interpreting these words that were written some 250 years ago. And so the meaning of these words and the meaning of these documents has incredible impact on our lives today. And I doubt that people 250 years ago would have thought, wow, what we're saying here today really means that much in the future. For example, the Constitutional Convention had a committee to draft the final words. And, it was chaired by Gouverneur Morris. And he basically wrote a lot of it. And basically we accept it. And we don't have any committee notes about why he wrote certain things. We've interpreted why he wrote it many times in the Supreme Court, but we really don't know. The only thing we really know is the debates that went on, and James Madison did keep reasonably good records about it, though we know now that he later edited those records a bit, so they may not be quite as accurate as we once thought.
A lot of the scholars we've spoken with, when they describe the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, these scholars tend to note that these were documents created at a specific moment in time and that they were meant to address specific problems of that time. But, to hear you talk about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and to have us think about these documents and their enduring words, we can really see that they have grown with the nation. So I wonder if you see anything in these founding documents, an element perhaps, that accounts for this remarkable feature in them that really has enabled them to grow and evolve over the last near 250 years.
Well, the remarkable thing is this. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were agreed to by white Christian propertied men of reasonable educations. Today, the country is not comprised majority of white Christian propertied men. So we have a document, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, which are more or less our governing documents, even though today the country is, 50% female and a large minority population. I would say roughly 40% of the population is minority. These documents were drafted, and when slavery was around, now people who were freed from the bonds of slavery, the descendants of slaves, they are governed by these same documents. So when you think back on it, it's amazing that these people who were not representative of today's society created documents and a government that we're still living by. Now, we obviously have amended it, we've interpreted many other things, but it is quite remarkable that we haven't had demands to have a new constitutional convention populated 50% by women and by a large percentage of minorities. It is interesting. I often wonder who would be in that constitutional convention? Who would be there today? What type of people would we have? Where would we find the Madisons and the John Jays and the Alexander Hamiltons? I don't really know, but it's a wonderful thing to think about who would actually be the person we'd want to have draft a new constitution for us if we ever went down that route.
That is a really interesting question. And I think I'm going to be thinking about my answer to that question for quite some time because I've never really considered it before. So thank you for that. Now, one of the things that you do in your book, The American Experiment, is you highlight 13 key genes or characteristics that have really made our American experiment in democracy possible. And these are genes or characteristics such as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the rule of law, and separation of government powers. And I'm curious, David, of the 13 key genes or characteristics that you highlight, do you see one or two as particularly key and necessary for our democracy?
Well, for those listening, what I was trying to do is to say each human being has millions of genes, let's say, but there's some that are more probably important than others. We don't really know, but we don't know exactly which genes are the most important. Some you may inherit, may make you smart. Some may make you tall. Some may make you have a predisposition to a disease, but you have these genes. In our country, the country's been made up over a couple hundred years by many different events and occurrences. And you could call all of these events and occurrences things that went into the body politic and created this United States of America that we have today. What I try to do is say, what were the most important of these genes? Which are the most important of these events or occurrences? And I came up with 13. There were 13 colonies. I came up with 13 genes. Obviously, somebody could come up with more or less. But they are things like the belief in the rule of law, the belief in the importance of voting, the belief in democracy, and so forth. And I've added a few that in recent years would be appropriate, but would not have been part of our genes 100 years ago. For example, diversity. We now believe generally that there's a view that the society is better off by having a diverse point of view and including people who may not have been included in things 200 years ago. That probably wasn't a gene 200 years ago. So these genes are designed to kind of say, these are what make us unique. So in any country in the world, we have more than 200 countries. You could go to any country and say, okay, in Germany or France, what are the unique things that we have in this country that made us different? In this country, I tried to come up with 13 that I think made us different than every other country, and that kind of embody what we're all about. Interestingly, when I asked the Harris Corporation to do a survey of Americans of what they thought was the most important gene or quality, they said overwhelmingly the right to free speech. 65% of Americans said that was the most important thing in our country. Now, whether that's true or not, that's what they said. In my own case, I would suspect the most important thing is the rule of law and probably the sense of equality and the importance of voting rights. But, obviously the First Amendment is up there. It's hard to distinguish one from another in terms of more important than any other.
Were you able to tell from your survey why Americans value the First Amendment as much as they do?
Well, I think it's because people like to have the freedom to say whatever they want. And so when you were a child, and when I was a child, people used to say to me, it's a free country, I can do what I want. You may remember this as a child. It's a free country. And to some extent, what they meant was it's a free country, you can say whatever you want. And so I think Americans value that. But it may also be the case that because we've had so many people fighting with each other figuratively in recent years, and maybe literally, people have such passionate views about things. They want to be able to express those views, and people don't feel like they should just be quiet, sit at home, and let other people express views for them. They want to say it themselves. So to some extent, we now are living in a world where everybody is able to communicate. 100 years ago or 200 years ago, people could communicate with each other only by letter writing or maybe newspaper writing, or you could read a newspaper. Now we have social media, we have podcasts, and everybody wants to be able to communicate their views. And to some extent, maybe the right to speech and free speech is more important today than even it was 200 years ago.
You raised an interesting point earlier, in that some of the aspects that make American democracy possible and that we would actually use to define our American democracy have really changed over time. Like aspects like equality wouldn't have been thought of the same way nearly 250 years ago as we think about it today. So do you think the adaptability and the ability of our democracy to add new key characteristics over time is something that really makes the American democracy durable?
Yes. The Constitution has lasted this long because it is considered to be relatively flexible. There is no other Constitution that's lasted this long, and typically constitutions fall apart because they don't turn out to be that flexible. Our flexibility is due to something I don't think that the founding fathers quite anticipated. They created three branches of government: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. But I don't think they thought the judicial branch would necessarily be the main interpreter of the laws in quite the way it's turned out. I don't know that they really thought that the judiciary would declare certain laws passed by Congress unconstitutional, but that's now taken as a given. I don't know that people thought that judiciary would decide presidential elections, but in Bush v. Gore, by one vote, the Supreme Court decided the election. The interesting thing is that we accept the rule of law, we accept the Supreme Court. While some of us might not like every decision of the Supreme Court, when the Supreme Court speaks, as a general rule of thumb, people don't say, well, that's just the Supreme Court's view, we don't really care what they think. People take that as a serious part of our body politic. And that, I think, is one of the things that's made it possible for us to be flexible, because the Supreme Court can act in ways that are not political, and they can come up with decisions that ultimately the country will accept. And that's given us flexibility to do things that I think Congress might not have had. For example, I don't think Congress will deal with the abortion issue. It's just too politically sensitive. So Congress will never say really whether abortion's legal or not legal. They'll effectively say it, but they're really going to support what the Supreme Court does. And the Supreme Court, 9 people on the court, will really decide what the policy is. And that's the way the system has worked. And it's given us enough flexibility to live with a document that's more than 240 years old.
I wonder if we could talk about the timing of your book, The American Experiment, because lots of historians, journalists, and government officials have really said that our democracy is in danger. And I'm curious if this is the reason why you decided to explore this question of American democracy and what makes it work, or if there was another reason for you to write this book.
Well, the question implies greater wisdom on my part than is the reality. The truth is, I wanted to do a book, and the truth is, it turned out that around the time that I was putting the book together, we had what I call a stress test of democracy, which is the election of last year and also the events of January 6th. Now, we've had stress tests in our country, as I point out in the book, the greatest one of which is the Civil War. But we've had others, the fights over Vietnam War, Watergate, 9/11, lots of stress tests. But this stress test was one that was relatively unique because you had a president who not only said, well, I'm not sure what the votes are, he said there was fraud. And never in the election of 2000 did Al Gore say there was absolutely fraud or George Bush say there was fraud. They basically said, let's count the votes or not count the votes. And then in the end, the Supreme Court made the decision. Here, the president of the United States was saying that he thought it was wrong, and he was trying to get things to be orchestrated so that he won the election. And that was quite unusual. So I said this was a stress test. And I said that the book should be dedicated for this reason to the public servants who preserve our democracy. And what I meant by that was the judges and election officials who said, no, the election wasn't fraudulent. The only fraudulent things were the claims that things were fraudulent. And so in the end, 65 judges threw out of the court the claims that the election was fraud. And so, it is interesting how we almost came, though, with a different election outcome. For example, people may not know this, but under the Constitution, if it goes to the House of Representatives for a decision, the vote is by congressional delegation. There are more Democrats than Republicans in the House. There were last year and there are now, but there are more delegations that are Republican. So if Vice President Pence had said, I'm not going to fulfill my constitutional obligation, and I'm basically going to walk away from it, let it go to the House, the election would have gone to the incumbent president because more delegations were Republican. So we did come relatively close to having the election overturned, much closer than people think, not because of the events of January 6th, but because our Constitution has certain weaknesses and flaws that can be exploited from time to time.
Plus, you also have the fact that the election of 2020 seemed to place a stress test of another key characteristic that you define in the American experiment, which is the peaceful transition of power, that we need peaceful transitions of power to help our democracy survive. And as you mentioned, on January 6, 2021, there was an assault on the United States Capitol and on members of Congress.
Yes, earlier today, I was at the archives and I did an interview of General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And we did it there because the Constitution is very important to military officials. And I asked him about the fact that in the end, we have peaceful passage of power in this country, and the military doesn't decide who's going to be the next president of the United States. And he said, yes, of course, that's our system. In other countries, I don't think that's necessarily the case. If you had been in any other country in the world and you saw the Capitol being invaded, as it was on January 6th, you would say, okay, we're about to have a military takeover. The tanks are going to be rolling in. But there are no tanks that rolled in that event because in the end, there was no takeover of the government. That is what is relatively unique about our country. I'm not sure that a lot of other countries wouldn't have had a military takeover and the incumbent president of the United States would have been able to get the military to support him or her. In our country, which is unique, the only country in the world where the military officers swear an allegiance not to a particular individual, but they swear it to a document, the Constitution of the United States. That's their allegiance. That's what they swear their allegiance to.
Keeping with this theme of democracy, in your book, The American Experiment, you also interviewed Michael Beschloss, who's a historian of the American presidency. And in this interview, you asked Beschloss a really interesting question. You asked him, what is the greatest miracle and what is the greatest threat to American democracy? So, David, I'd like to pose this question to you. What do you think is the greatest miracle and the greatest threat to American democracy?
Well, the greatest miracle about American democracy is that one document with 27 amendments has lasted this long, and that on balance, while we have our challenges, people that believe in representative democracy and believe in democratic values generally have looked to the United States as a beacon of the best way to run a democracy, even though we recognize we have lots of flaws in it. The biggest challenge to our democracy right now is that many people are unwilling to accept the election results of the last presidential election. Many people are unwilling to cooperate and work in a bipartisan way. When I worked in Congress in the late 1970s and the White House in the late 1970s, it was generally recognized that Republicans and Democrats had different points of view, but they socialized with each other, they negotiated with each other, they met with each other, they had conference committees, they passed bills, and very often you had a lot of bipartisan legislation. I'd say from the time that President Obama became president, you saw essentially no more bipartisan activity. Essentially, everything is either one party or the other. Like, for example, the Affordable Care Act, no Republican votes. The tax cuts of President Trump, essentially no Democratic votes. And the things that President Biden is passing now or trying to pass are essentially going to have no Republican votes. So it's really unfortunate that we've reached a point where the Democrats and Republicans are not socializing with each other, they're not working with each other. And they really feel that they're representing their constituents, and the constituents are relatively divided. In 1960, John Kennedy campaigned in about 45 states. Richard Nixon campaigned in all 50 states. Why would they do that? Because it wasn't clear then whether a state was red or blue. You could probably guess, but it wasn't clear. So they went to as many states as possible. Today, when you're running a presidential campaign, you probably go to about 12 states because every other state, you know how it's going to go. The country's just bitterly divided. And unfortunately, our electoral college system kind of facilitates this division, I think, more than we would like.
That's a really good point. The fact that Democrats and Republicans aren't reaching across the aisle and even socializing anymore the way that they used to. And like you, I think this is a rather new development because we've spoken with scholars like Rachel Shelden, who in episode 78 told us how right up until South Carolina's secession from the Union in December 1860, congressmen were always social with each other, even if they really viewed the key issue of the day, slavery, very differently from each other. You know, these men still boarded in the same boarding houses with each other. They attended the same social functions. And because they were boarding together, they often enjoyed meals and drinks with each other. And scholars have pointed out that really starting in the 1990s, Washington started to lose this social nature, that congressmen started to fly home on weekends and not even relocate to Washington during their terms of office.
Yes. Members of Congress used to live in boarding houses, and they would basically stay during the congressional sessions. When jet travel became possible, members felt they had to go back to their district, and they would go back every weekend or every other weekend, so they're not around as much. There used to be a thing called a codel, which was a congressional delegation going abroad, where members actually bonded with each other, but because these were considered junkets, they've essentially eliminated them. At those codels, Democrats and Republicans would socialize with each other, get to know each other, and could work with each other. There also used to be a thing called legislation that you had through committees. Remember, committees used to have hearings, then they would pass bills, then there would be conference committees. Well, now we don't really do that. All legislation of any consequence is really done at the leadership level. So you don't tend to have conference committees in the way you used to. You don't have hearings. You don't have members having to know each other. And so it's a very unusual situation. In fact, I started a program 5 years ago or so to kind of bring members together where I would interview a great American historian in front of members of Congress only. We do it at the Library of Congress. We'd have a dinner there. And to my surprise, 200 or 300 members would show up saying that they love this because they can meet people from the opposite party and there's no press there. There's no social media to criticize them for meeting with the opposite party. And so they could actually meet people they didn't really know. And it turns out that many people in the House don't know anybody in the Senate because they don't have conference committees anymore. And people who are Democrats rarely socialize with Republicans anymore. So that's a big change, and it's not a good situation in my view. I hope we can find ways to overcome this. But right now, Democrats and Republicans are not really talking to each other. Rarely do they socialize anymore. And that's in part because social media has picked up everything you do. And there's one other factor, which is mother's milk of politics, which is money. Campaigns are very expensive, and members of Congress are deathly afraid they won't be reelected. So even though most members who choose to run are reelected, members are always afraid they're not going to be reelected. So they think if they have a lot of money, they will probably get reelected. And if you have more money, you usually do get reelected. But they raise money for their reelection. They also raise it to give it to other members to kind of help them in their reelection campaigns. They also use it to, I would say, stockpile money so they can scare people into not campaigning against them or running against them. And also, you can keep the money. After you leave Congress, you can keep this money for political purposes, and you can have a big, slush fund to do what you want for political purposes. So members of Congress are raising funds all the time. And that's another reason they don't talk to each other. They're busy on the phone raising money from their constituents.
David, if you don't mind, I'd like for us to take a moment for our episode sponsor, and then I'd like to turn our conversation to other aspects of your interest in history, specifically your collecting and your philanthropy.
Hi, I'm Rob Parkinson, Associate Professor of History at Binghamton University, and my new book, 13 Clocks, How Race United the Colonies and Made the Declaration of Independence, published by the Omohundro Institute, is out now. This book covers the 15 months between Lexington and Concord and the Declaration of Independence, and we think we know that story cold. Especially in 1776, it is a straight march from Thomas Paine and common sense through Thomas Jefferson denouncing the king in the Declaration of Independence. What I have found is we have forgotten so much of what happens in those 15 months, and especially about the presence of African Americans and Native Americans in that story, and then worries and opportunities about how we can exploit these fears and use that as a basis for this extremely fragile thing of unity. Get your copy of 13 Clocks, How Race United the Colonies and Made the Declaration of Independence, wherever you buy your books.
And if you'd like more information about Rob's book, 13 Clocks, and where you can purchase a copy, visit benfranklinsworld.com/clocks. That's benfranklinsworld.com/clocks. David, you are a generous and major supporter of history organizations and projects. And you're also an avid collector of history books, pamphlets, and ephemera. And to give us an idea of some of the things you collect, located in the David M. Rubenstein Gallery at the National Archives, we can go see the exhibit Records of Rights, where there is your copy of a 1297 Magna Carta. Now, Michael notes that he recently saw the exhibit Close Encounters in the Colonies at the New York Historical Society, and that exhibit happens to feature items from your Americana collection. So Michael wonders if you could tell us a bit more about your early Americana collection and the items that are in it, and also about your philosophy when it comes to collecting. What kind of items do you collect and why do you collect them?
Okay, first on the documents. I did buy, the first one was the Magna Carta. Then I started buying Declarations of Independence. I own a fair number of the stone copies, which are the perfect replicas of the original copy, and a fair number of copies of the Emancipation Proclamation signed by Lincoln or the 13th Amendment that freed slaves. And what I do is I put all of these things on display so that people can see them. And the theory behind it is if you see the text of the Declaration of Independence, you can look at it on a computer slide. But if you actually see the original, before you go to see it, you're probably going to read more about it. When you're there, you're going to be educated about it. And after you leave, you'll probably read more about it. And that is important to me because we don't know very much about our background, our history right now. As you probably know, and as I pointed out in the book, I don't have a country anymore where we teach history and civics very much. And so my theory is if we can get people to be interested in historic documents or historic monuments like the Washington Monument or the Jefferson Memorial and so forth, people might learn more about our history. The theory of representative democracy is you have an informed citizenry. Right now, we don't teach American history very much. We don't teach civics very much. And so that has been a real challenge. And so I've also tried to have a historic Americana book collection. So I have, a very large collection. Many people think it's one of the better ones of Americana. And it's, has all the things you would think. A large number of copies of the Federalist Papers or other prominent books in our American history, things that are, I would say, quite rare. They tend to be first editions in very good shape. And they are ones that I now lend out to organizations. A lot are at the New York Historical, Duke University, where I went to college. There's another exhibition about to open up on Abraham Lincoln and books I have relating to Lincoln. So I use these things to educate people and to try to hope that maybe by getting interested in these things, they might, become more informed about our American history.
So your philanthropy and collecting are really organized around your principle of people should know more about this and they should be educated about the origins of the United States and how its government works through the documents that help create this government and are related to different subjects about its origins.
This part of my philanthropy, most of my money goes to scholarships and things like that, or to medical research. But this part of my philanthropy is called Patriotic Philanthropy, where I'm trying to remind people of the history and heritage of our country. It gets more attention than it deserves because not that many people are doing this, relatively speaking. So if Bill Gates gives $1 billion to malaria research, it probably doesn't get that much attention. If I fix up the Washington Monument for $10 million, it gets more attention than his much bigger malaria gift, just because it's seen as different or unusual that a private citizen would fix up the Washington Monument. But in any event, I do give a fair amount of money to patriotic philanthropy causes, and I'm trying to encourage other people to do so as well.
How did you become involved in patriotic philanthropy? It sounds like this is a very different kind of philanthropy where a private citizen's goal is to set out and do something positive for their country and for American society, and that you're meeting this goal by helping to educate people about the history and origins of their country.
Like most things that happen in life that are probably useful, it wasn't by sitting down and trying to think it up. It was by serendipity. So when I started buying documents, I started putting them on display. I started fixing monuments. I got some attention for it. And in the end, I coined the phrase patriotic philanthropy, designed to mean reminding people the history and heritage of our country. All philanthropy is really patriotic. So if you give philanthropy to support a hospital, that's patriotic too, but it's just a different kind of way of looking at patriotism. So it's something that I have been proud of doing. And I know I get many people thanking me for what I'm doing to help the country when I think, this is relatively modest compared to somebody that's volunteering, going in the military and risking his or her life, to me, that's an incredible patriotic act, much far greater than anything that I'm doing.
So what do you think is the most interesting item that you've collected, either for your collection or for the public use?
Well, I would say the Magna Carta is unique. It's the only one in private hands. So that is unique, and probably there'll never be another one quite like that. I don't think that's something discovered that we don't know about today. I do have a large collection of so-called stone copies of the Declaration of Independence. These are the perfect replicas made in 1823. So when you see the New York Times published on July the 4th, the copy of the Declaration of Independence, you're seeing a so-called stone copy because the original one was fading and now faded beyond recognition. And so what you're really seeing is a stone copy. And, those are all pretty valuable. And then I think the Emancipation Proclamation is valuable. The original is in the archives, but Lincoln signed 47 souvenir copies, of which maybe 10 or so survive. I own a number of them. I've lent them, one to the African American History and Culture Museum and one various other places around the country. So I would say no one document is more important than the other, but the most important thing is getting people to be interested in learning more about this. That's much more important.
Speaking of the different documents in your collection, Sarah notes that one of the items you recently purchased was the missing 19th century visitor logs to the Bunker Hill Monument. And the Bunker Hill Monument is the nation's first large-scale memorial to the American Revolution. It stands 221 foot tall. It's an obelisk. And it took 17 years to build between 1825 and 1842. And it was famously dedicated in 1843. Now, this monument was made possible not just by the work of the Bunker Hill Monument Association and its members, but also by the work of Sarah Josepha Hale and Judah Toro. Sarah wonders if you could tell us more about these visitor logs, David, and what they reveal about the history of the monument.
Yes, the Bunker Hill Monument has kept for, since it was open, logs of visitors, particularly prominent visitors. And it turns out that there was an auction that I heard about there. The logs of people who visited, I think from the 1800s, was going to be for sale. And I checked and apparently it was stolen in some ways. How else would anybody gotten the logs? So I decided I would buy these logs and give it to the Monument Association, which I did. And, very often I find things that may be relevant to certain people and then give them to them because it's more important to them than to me. In this particular case, I thought they should have their complete collection of people who visited. And in fact, in one of the logs, there's Mrs. Abraham Lincoln, it turned out, visited the monument and her signature was in there.
I never knew that. I never knew Mrs. Lincoln visited the monument. And perhaps this is something that we wouldn't have known because we were lacking these logs. But when I worked at the monument as an interpretive ranger in the early 2000s, it really feels like something we would have promoted about the monument is that Mary Todd Lincoln had visited it. So thank you for your purchase and for filling in this bit of history.
Well, somebody faked her signature or she visited, one of the two.
Chloe and Cassie have questions about how historical societies and organizations can support themselves. First, Chloe wonders if you have any ideas about how smaller museums, historical societies, and archives can seek more funding for their important work.
That's a difficult question because people want to focus on, very often, medical research or scientific breakthrough research or things that are going to get a lot of public attention, perhaps. Supporting historical, I would say, monuments, memorials, historical associations is difficult to do. There aren't that many that are really able to attract that much attention. I'd say you've got to get a relatively good board of people who are willing to, I would say, not only give some money, but help get some money. I was last night given an award by the New York Historical Society, and Tony Fauci was given an award as well. And they have a very good group of supporters at the New York Historical Society, but it's a unique organization. There isn't a similar organization in every other city in the United States. And it's not just about New York history, it's about all history. But it seems that history doesn't get people's attention as much. So when Sputnik went up, people said, we got to learn more about science. When the Chinese became more important, we said we've got to catch up with the Chinese or get ahead of them and have a STEM education. People didn't say, well, all of a sudden we don't learn more about history. So think about this. If we had learned more about history, people would say, well, maybe we shouldn't be in South Vietnam because there's no way that we can win a war over there. Or maybe we shouldn't go into Afghanistan because people have tried that for thousands of years, or at least certainly hundreds of years, and haven't been able to really get control over Afghanistan. Or maybe we shouldn't go into Iraq because the Sunnis and the Shiites are going to kill each other, and it's not something that we can really control. Knowledge of history would have helped a lot in these decisions, but getting people to understand history and getting these associations to raise money is not easy. And I would say that it's sad that there aren't that many people who are doing this. And very often you find people who are interested in history who are, say, my age, which is, not that young anymore. So when I look at organizations of historical societies and associations, you tend to get people probably more above the age of 50 than below the age of 50. And you tend to get a lot of people who are more white than non-white. So for whatever reason, we've got to find a way to get this to a more diverse group and also get this to a younger group.
I agree with what you said, and yet it's still interesting because we do have a fair number of doctors, scientists, and technologists who listen to this podcast because they say that studying the humanities and studying history really makes them better at their scientific and technological work.
Well, it's an interesting thing. I interviewed, and it's in this book, David McCullough. David McCullough did a terrific book on the Wright brothers, neither of whom had gone to college, neither of whom had ever been trained as an engineer, neither of whom had any aeronautical background. But they had always read books. They read history books. And David McCullough said what they got from reading history books and literature books was incredible curiosity. And that is what really helped make them so successful. With spending less than $1,000, they more or less invented the airplane. You could say a major historic breakthrough. And other people more trained in science really weren't able to do that. Right now, we have a divide in our country. Sometimes people that are humanitarians, or I should say humanists, and are people who are social scientists, they say, I don't understand science, as if it's a foreign thing. Or scientists will say, well, I don't understand history. I don't understand philosophy. But the truth is, people that can bridge the two really make more progress in life. So someone like Leonardo da Vinci or Albert Einstein, or people like Benjamin Franklin, or people like Steve Jobs, people that Walter Isaacson's written about, they tended to have a fairly good knowledge about history and things relating to the humanities, as well as about science.
Now, Cassie wonders if you think the best model for supporting historical institutions and historical work is really through private donations, or whether you might have ideas for ways that we can influence our local, state, and national governments to better support history and historical organizations.
I think getting some government support would be helpful. I think it's always going to wind up being disappointing to people because governments are always, looking for different kinds of things to support. I noticed that, it's very rare that you have government giving that much support to historical society or association or the preservation of documents. It happens. I think an effort can be made, but I think a better effort would probably be to get more people interested in the cause and to work from a concentric circle and keep getting more and more people to learn more about it, having lectures, having authors come in and talk about what they're working on, and showing people how little they know about history is a very important thing. And as you know from my book, it is the case that people who learn about history in this country very often tend to be people that come to this country. So 91% of the people that take the citizenship exam pass it. But it turns out that a similar exam was given to native-born Americans, and only one state, Vermont, could a majority of the citizens pass the basic citizenship test that you have to pass to become a citizen here, which shows you that people don't really know much about our history.
Well, we're all great lovers of history here. And I wonder if you have any advice for those of us who would like to do more to support the historical research and the museums and institutions that are really important to us because we do love history. How do you think we can get into what you call patriotic philanthropy when our funds are just a bit more limited?
Well, I think it's very good to pick one or two organizations. And in my case, I've been fortunate I have the means to do more than one or two, but I would find one or two that you're really, really passionate about. And your passion will ultimately, I think, convince other people to help support what you want to do and help follow you. But I think the pleasure of doing this is not only are you helping an organization, but you're learning yourself. And as I was saying last night in my remarks, I think there's a special place in heaven for those who help other people learn about history. People laugh when I said that, but I said, why would you want to take a chance? And I might be right. So think that you might be, doing something really useful for your country and your society by getting people educated more about history. But is there a simple way? No. I would find one organization or maybe two that you really think is important in your local area, and then try to get other people interested as well. Then try as well to get younger people interested, not just people my age or older.
David, you close out your book, The American Experiment, with an interview with Associate Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor. And in that interview, you and Justice Sotomayor discuss how an obligation of citizenship is to be a well-informed citizen, to know the history of your nation and to know how your government works. What do you think that we as everyday Americans can do to become more informed citizens? And how do you see the upcoming 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States in 2026 playing a role in our work to think more about, learn more about, and commemorate our democracy?
Well, reading is always important. I encourage people to read. I think it's surprising how few people really read a lot of books. And I encourage people to read history books or other things that will give them a sense of history. I just think that's one of the most important things you could do, is to really learn more about what this country has been all about and try to go to lectures or read things online or read books. I think that's very valuable. In terms of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, I lived through the 200th anniversary in 1976, and I think that went reasonably well in terms of motivating Americans to do things. Whether this one will be quite as big, I don't know, but I do think that it will probably spur more patriotism, more learning about our country's background and history. I hope so, because right now I'm afraid that if we don't go in the direction of learning more about history, particularly the founding fathers and the principles this country stands for, we ultimately are likely to go in a version of society where history is irrelevant. Now, why is history relevant to begin with? It's because the theory is if you learn about history, you can avoid the mistakes that have been made in the past, and you can make a better life for yourself and your country in the future by avoiding those mistakes. If you don't know about the mistakes, you might make them again. So that's why we really want to learn history, to avoid the mistakes of the past and to learn from the good things that were done in the past so the civilization can progress.
Now we should proceed into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Now, David, given your knowledge of the Declaration of Independence and the founding, I thought I'd ask you a question that I've been mulling over as I research my book on the Articles of Confederation. And lately, I've been doing a lot of reading about John Dickinson. So in your opinion, David, what might have happened if John Dickinson had supported the move for independence in 1776, which in reality, he really didn't do? But if he did, if he had supported independence in July of 1776, what would have happened if he had written the Declaration of Independence instead of Thomas Jefferson? How do you think the founding of the United States might have been different?
Well, as you know, the Declaration of Independence was a propaganda document or a public relations document to some extent. It has had some binding legal effect, but not all that much compared to the Constitution. I think at the time, had Dickinson written it much earlier than 1776, it probably would have fallen on deaf ears. He probably would have been executed because the country wasn't quite ready for a revolution then. And it wasn't quite ready even when we had it in 1776. As you know, many people in that era were tarred and feathered or were killed because they were people who were supporting one side or the other. Revolutionary people were going after people who were loyalists, and loyalists were going after people who were revolutionaries. It's probably not the case that more than 50% of Americans were in favor of revolution at the time of the Declaration of Independence, probably maybe closer to a third, if that. So it was an unusual situation. It's always hard to do counterfactuals. I'll give you one example of that. So at the Kennedy School, when Mr. Gorbachev came after he was the president of the Soviet Union, he came to make a speech. And he was asked by a student, well, tell us how history would be different if in 1963 in November, Nikita Khrushchev had been assassinated and John Kennedy had not been assassinated. How would the world have been different? How would history have been different? And without missing a beat, Mr. Gorbachev said, well, nobody can tell for sure, but one thing you can tell for certain is that Aristotle Onassis would not have married Mrs. Khrushchev. So, pretty quick-witted response, I guess. But I would say, generally, it's hard to know how these things would turn out. Suppose the South had won the Civil War. Suppose the United States had not come into World War II. Suppose we had better protection facilities against 9/11, and therefore Iraq and Afghanistan hadn't happened. And suppose politicians in the early 60s were more honest about what we could do in Vietnam. So you never really know. That's one of the interesting things about life. You just don't know how history would have been different if certain factual things had occurred differently.
And it is amazing to think of how history happened the way that it did, given that all sorts of circumstances and actions and decisions had to happen at the right time and in a certain order to produce the events that happened in the past.
You think about it, the Earth itself, as I try to point out in my book, is very unique. It came together through lots of different things we know about the Big Bang and all of that. But suppose the Earth were 20 million miles closer to the sun or 20 million miles further away, maybe life wouldn't have been able to be sustained, or maybe things would have been much different than they are today. In America, a life came together and created this country the way we have it because of a lot of unusual circumstances, any one of which had not occurred. Maybe we'd have a different country. For example, as I mentioned earlier, the Civil War had gone a different way. Well, maybe the United States would now be two countries. Who knows? Or maybe if, the French-Indian War had gone differently, maybe we'd be speaking French. It's just hard to know.
Now, before we conclude, you host a couple of podcasts. Would you care to tell us more about them and where we can listen?
Yes. I do an interview for the New York Historical Society every so often, and those interviews are typically about American history. And so those interviews are made into a podcast, and that podcast is broadcast by the New York Historical Society, and it's called For the Ages, obviously a takeoff on what was said at Abraham Lincoln's assassination by one of his cabinet secretaries. Now he's For the Ages. And then I have another podcast that takes my Bloomberg interviews that I do on Bloomberg and PBS, not about history, but on other subjects, like the one I did today. I interviewed for that show General Milley, our chairman of Joint Chiefs, and that is done in podcast form as well. I've looked at other ways I can do more things specifically just for the podcast. At the moment, I'm taking interviews that I'm doing for television and they're making them into a podcast, but I'm trying to do something comparable to what you're doing, which is to do something just for podcasts. And I hope to be able to do that at some point, but I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do it better than you are.
Is there any aspect of history that you're looking forward to covering in a new exhibit, book, or podcast episode?
Well, I'm looking forward to covering my 100th birthday, but I am actually very interested now in doing much more about modern day America, not just the colonial era and revolutionary era, but I think very few people know as much as I would like them to know about things that occurred during my lifetime. For example, I have 3 children, 36, 33, and 30. But when I mentioned John F. Kennedy, where I'm the chairman of the Kennedy Center, and he was the president of the United States, the 35th president, killed in 1963, many of them don't know much about him. And many of them don't know much about President Eisenhower or even my former boss, Jimmy Carter. So I think we ought to let our younger people learn more about 20th century or 21st century figures, because it's nice to know about the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, but also knowing more about things more recent is also important to me.
And where's the best place to learn more about you, your work, and your podcasts?
I think there's a website, davidrubenstein.com, where I have a lot of my things that I'm doing on that. And that's a way to learn more about what I'm doing.
David Rubenstein, thank you for joining us and for letting us explore your interests in democracy and history. I think we all had some fun.
Thank you very much for having me, and give my best regards to Benjamin Franklin.
There's a lot that we can take away from our conversation with David. First, we can recognize the important role that history and historical knowledge play in our democracy and in our quest to be good citizens. The founding generation built American democracy with the understanding that it should rest on the shoulders of a well-informed citizenry. Being a well-informed citizen means understanding the origins of the United States and how the government that represents us works. Now, you do a lot of this work just by tuning into this podcast. We often have episodes about the origins of the United States, how it came to be, and about the history of the ideas and institutions that make our government function. We also investigate how these ideas and institutions have evolved over time, and knowing this information really helps us all be better citizens. A second takeaway from our conversation could be that democracies are fragile. We're living through stress tests to our democracy, and when you think about it, these are the biggest stress tests to our democracy since the nation divided over slavery and dissolved into the Civil War. How do we fix that which divides us? David suggests that we develop a better understanding of history and see what the past can tell us about our own time. Plus, we should remember that history helps us consider and be open to multiple points of view and how to better understand people. History helps us develop empathy for people. The more empathy and understanding that we create within ourselves, the more empathy and understanding we'll have as we confront the tough issues that face us and challenge our democracy in our present. Now, a third takeaway from our conversation is that history is about people. History can tell us who we are and how we came to be who we are if we pay attention to it. And it's also about how and why people have acted and changed their societies over time. History is really the study of change over time. But more than just the actual study of history being about people, past and present, the ways that we support history, its production, and the spread of historical knowledge is also about people. If we enjoy history and if we believe that it is valuable to ourselves and to our nation, then we need people. We need you to help support it. As David mentioned, you can get started, if you haven't already, by looking locally at historical societies, historic sites, archives, and museums right in your own town or county. And if you believe in the work that these organizations are doing, you can volunteer your time to help them with their work. You can also help these organizations expand their reach by telling your friends, family, and neighbors about them. And you can also donate your money to support their projects and initiatives. History is about people, and it needs your study and support. If you'd like more information about David, his book, The American Experiment, and information about the podcasts he hosts and the exhibits he's made possible through his philanthropy, visit the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/315. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. This episode of Ben Franklin's World is supported by an American Rescue Plan grant to the Omohundro Institute from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team: Joseph Edelman, Jessica Brabble, Martha Howard, and Holly White. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, do you think it's strange that we keep trying to amend the Constitution of 1787 rather than calling for a new constitutional convention that would create a government that's more representative of the United States today? I thought David raised a really interesting point and question here, and I'm curious what you think. Let me know. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute and is sponsored by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation.